do the thing? Okay, I'm live. Yay! Hi there, it's Becky from the Beckisphere, and welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, hi, I'm a derp named Becky, and every Monday and Thursday we talk about the climate crisis here. The problems, yes, but the solutions, yes. So if that sounds like something you'd be interested in, go ahead and hit that subscribe button below, click the like, comment on things you want to see related to the climate on this channel, and well, you have clicked on our weekly climate book club live stream where we are talking about the book Don't Even Think About It by George Marshall, Why Our Brains Are Wired to Ignore Climate Change. And we chose this as we being my mom and I. So she's the voice that's off in the ether, that occasionally has to go and like let dogs in that are wanting in and out of the room. So okay, now we have Carly. All right. So this week we are talking about chapters 12 through 15. And the first chapter that we're going to talk about is called Uncertain Long-Term Costs, Why Our Cognitive Biases Line Up Against Climate Change. So again, a little bit about this book if you are new. Basically, it talks about why we are not, as humans, able to really process climate change and why we haven't done as much about it as the problem suggests we should. So that is what is being covered in this book. And if you hear a whining noise in the background throughout this video, it is the other dog, Charity.
I'm going to put her out.
And I don't know why she's whining. I really couldn't tell you.
Go on.
Anyways, so the first thing that we found interesting in chapter 12, which is on page 56, is that the main author, George Marshall, was talking to a Nobel Prize winning psychologist that specialized in decision making. And he was discussing the main parts about climate change which make our minds not really think of them. The first one is climate change lacks salience, which means prominent or demanding attention. So it doesn't, we don't feel the need to just immediately act on it. Like, for example, another current thing that's going on right now. The pandemic, for example, we feel the need to immediately act on that. And we don't feel the immediate need to act on climate change. The second thing that the psychologist, whose name is Daniel Kahneman, I think. Daniel Kahneman, it talks about why we don't understand climate change. The second point is that it requires that people accept certain short-term costs and reductions in their standard of living in order to mitigate against higher but uncertain losses that are far into the future. And that's something that, yeah, I've seen from, experiencing me attempting to talk to other people about the climate and their responses. It's very often that people don't see it as a short-term problem, or if they do, they see only the negative short-term costs that they would need to solve the problem, what would individually have to come from them, kind of thing. And that's something that a lot of climate change deniers like to talk about, especially is, oh, we're taking away your jobs and your cows. And and that's obviously not the whole picture, but it's a great way to straw man the issue. And the third thing that the psychologist mentions, that con man, which sounds like, is it con man?
It starts with a K though.
Yeah, it's Kahneman. It's not con man, but it's con man. So the third thing that con man says is information about climate change seems uncertain and contested. And we will get more into that on future chapters, but that's also another thing that I'm not surprised about, because that's something I've definitely experienced. So one thing that Conman said is that to mobilize people, it requires an emotional issue. And that is something, again, that has been contested between chapters, whether or not it should be considered, oh, hi, Patrick. I don't know who you are, but hi. Thank you for joining. If you have any comments, by the way, those who are viewing, please go ahead and comment, and I will make sure that I'm paying attention to the chat so that you can have your input in this, because that's why it's a live stream, is I want to have that conversation with you. Even if you haven't read the book, if there's points that you feel like you have an opinion on or you would like to speak up about, please feel free to post in the comments, and I will read those comments out loud and talk more about them with you. I want this to be a going dialogue. So this is for y'all. So the main three problems for why we cannot address climate change very well is, one, climate change lacks any prominence or demanding attention. It's not like the current pandemic where people are literally dying in front of us. I hope everyone's staying safe. Yeah. And the second point that the psychologist says that makes us not be able to react properly to climate change is that it requires people to accept certain short-term costs and reduce their standard of living for a possible long-term reduction of cost, if that makes sense. And the third main reason is that people see it as an uncertain issue. And again, we'll get more into why people might feel that way in future chapters. So that was just all on page 56 and 57 of the book, Don't Even Think About It, by George Marshall. It's been recommended by Bill Nye, if that makes your childhoodness happy. Anyways, okay. So one of the things that he talks about specifically are that we all have our own cognitive biases, depending on how we grew up, how we were raised. That will depend, therefore, on how we act on this issue. If we are raised to look at long-term effects, if we are raised in a position where we feel like we can think about those long-term impacts, because I know a lot of people, speaking of like hierarchy of needs, if you don't have the necessities that you need, then that is going to be especially hard to think of long-term impacts, because you're just trying to focus on surviving for the day. So that's another thing where it's kind of a privilege to have this problem to think about almost, and yet it's going to be more impactful on those who don't have the time to think about it. So weird how that is. He didn't say that. That's me saying that. But and so that's another part that he brings up, though, is basically that it really depends on your bias, how you grew up, how you are able to view the issue, on whether or not you feel like it's something that personally impacts you enough to feel like you should act on it now, even though the major losses might be in the future, or whether or not you should ignore the issue. So so that is basically what happens in chapter 12. Now, chapter 13 is called Them, There, and Then, How We Push Climate Change Far Away. And this, again, talks about kind of the first point. It doesn't seem like an immediate threat. So, sorry. So a lot of people, including President Obama, when he was addressing the issue of climate change, talked about it as something that will be a problem for future generations, and we should do it in order to make sure that future generations don't have to go through a travesty. And even who is she? She is the head of the International Monetary Fund, Christine Lagarde, and I don't know if she's still.
No, I don't think she still is.
No, but she was in 2014 when this book was written. She talks about how she fears that future generations, this is a quote from her, will be roasted, toasted, fried, and grilled. Now, that is a great image. I know exactly that that's what she was going for, is to try to be blunt and just like speak the image, but she still put the fact that it says future generations, which detaches the problem from current people. So, so that's one aspect, is time. We don't feel like it's a problem that's happening right now, but that is not the only thing that George Marshall talks about in the term of salience, of lacking salience. The other one is prioritization of certain things. And we can see that definitely in how we are currently looking at political issues, especially in terms of the pandemic. Obviously, the pandemic, even though some scientists have argued that more people are going to die as a result of climate change than as a result to COVID, which is a crazy thing to think about because we are in the middle of that right now. So we are currently prioritizing things that are happening more directly right now than things that might impact us greater, but in the future.
So I would say the only difference, and this comes back in another chapter further on, is the fires. The fires talk about being roasted.
And hurricanes.
And the hurricanes.
And the floods.
So just after, so this was written in 2014. Our biggest fires, our first big fires, were in 2017. 17.
When was Paradise? 16 or 17?
Oh, I think that might have been the year after, maybe 18. I think the Santa Rosa fire. Well, anyway, there. Anyway, it was after this book was written, and we are already starting to feel a lot more immediate threats. So
yeah, definitely. That is true. Though my rebuttal for that, which had been talked about in earlier chapters, is that we see fires and hurricanes and floods as natural disasters.
Yes.
There's things that have always happened. So it can be hard for us as individuals to look at an event and say, wow, that was much worse than it was in the past.
Mm-hmm.
You know? We can look at the data to support that, but not everyone's necessarily compelled by the data. And because it's a long-term impact, because it's a slow, one of the terms I learned in one of my environmental studies class, I think it was living in the age of the Anthropocene, which is arguably one of the best names of the class.
Dying in the age of the Anthropocene.
No, that was a book that we read, but it was called Living in the Age of the Anthropocene. Okay. And one of the things that we talked about was a term called slow violence. And slow violence was a form of environmental racism where those who are more directly impacted by climate change have kind of their own environment swept out from underneath them because of the changing environment. That happens a lot, especially with Indigenous people who have been on this land for generations, and they are experiencing slow violence because the land that they have evolved with, that they have adapted with, is slowly changing and coming out from underneath them. So it's an interesting term because it is so slow that it can be hard to quantify and hard to prosecute, you know? So, wow. Yeah. Anyways, we are still in chapter 13. And another thing that George talks about in this book is comparing how we are seeing climate change to other problems that received also a lot of attention at the time. One of the ones that I like is that there's also an optimism bias, which is basically what in another environmental class, I think it was just intro to environmental studies, we talked about as not in my backyard. Yeah, but they call it here optimism bias, which is basically, for example, other smokers are more risk of heart attack than you if you do smoke, you know? Like we disassociate, oh no, that couldn't happen to us. Yes, the data says that, but no, that couldn't happen to us, right? We disassociate ourselves from the problem, saying, well, I haven't seen it necessarily, it hasn't happened to me yet, so therefore I must be more lucky than other people that it's already happened to, you know. So that's another reason why we don't really talk about climate change as much. And he also compares it to the 1999 New Year's Eve Y2K, which is really funny because Mom comments in this. She was a computer engineer at that point. So she was really, both my parents were in the thick of it. We usually went on vacation around Christmas time, but that year I remember specifically we stayed there because they were both freaking out that the computers weren't being able to handle it.
I was at Hewlett-Packard, and I was in charge of the hot site team for the kernel of the Unix operating system. There was a lot of work that went into that to get that ready.
Yeah. And so
freaked.
She was a little offended by this part where it basically said that people who did a lot to prep for it and people that did nothing to prep for it had the same result, which was that everything was fine. She specifically put like, no. We worked on it.
Yeah, we worked hard.
We only survived it because we prepped the software for it.
We made a lot of patches and got it ready. Sorry. Okay.
But no. That's an important point because sometimes we forget how much prep work we really put into something when a disaster hits.
Yeah.
Like we don't think about that we did anything to end the Cold War, that we didn't do anything to prepare for that, that we didn't do anything to prep to make sure there wouldn't be another 9/11. We kind of forget. We kind of think, oh, that just hasn't happened. But it's because we put in all this like work to make sure it hasn't happened, right?
Yeah.
And for some reason, we're very good at forgetting what we've done. Which is also why people give crap to themselves more than to other people. You tend to remember things that other people have done more than you've done. Anyways, that's a different thing. And then another thing that was talked about in this chapter, now I'm on page 61, it's just that scientists have tried to provide imagery to issues that seem far away, like climate change, but providing something like a doomsday clock. They've tried to make it seem very dramatic and like a big deal and stuff to try to get people to like snap into realizing that this is a problem. And it hasn't worked. We've had the clock 5 minutes to midnight for a long time.
That's just a depressing clock.
It's just a depressing clock. And that brings me to another part, which is just that there's a very narrow boundary. This is on page 62. There's a very narrow boundary between not believing that the problem is happening at all and being so afraid that you're immobilized. So that is, that's a big issue with it, is that people think that it's just, it's people are kind of numb to it.
Yeah.
And I think that's also the case with our current situation, is that people are becoming numb to it and then people are becoming stupid. Well, people started stupid to some extent, but America. Anyways, okay, so I'm patriotic, I swear.
Move on.
Okay. So, but that brings me to the fact that he talks about how we had a lot of those deadlines. We had, in 10 years, the world is going to end, and I think that's been a huge problem with the media.
Because you can't trust
reporting.
You can't trust.
Yeah, because if something doesn't follow through, then it's just more validation that it wasn't a problem at all, which is not true, but that's how people view it. And I think it's, having so many of those tipping points has really backfired on scientists and environmentalists, because when those tipping points pass and you're not seeing a drastic change, then people are like, they were all being excitable for nothing. It's just like a Mayan calendar deadline.
There was one of those, though, that I put a mark on that said about the fires.
Oh, yeah.
Because whoever that guy was that talked about...
He was pretty right.
He was right.
Yeah. So he asked Andrew Simmons, who invented the campaign slogan. What was the campaign slogan? Okay, I can't... 10 years to save the planet, I think.
Yeah. Something
like that. So the guy that said that said, we open up the windows and find that it's still a beautiful day. Of course, we never see that the sky would set fire and all forests burn. But really what happens is that it becomes more rather than less likely than that we go over the safe threshold and positive feedbacks kick in. And he said that in 2016.
No,
he said that it would happen in 2016, that that the sky would be set fire and that all forests would burn. And that was pretty damn accurate. And it's just like, you know. And that leads me to another part, which is just that he says in this, and I'll link an old video where it talks about how long we have known that climate change is a problem. He specifically says, you know, that Joseph Fourier in 1824 and Savant Arrhenius in 1896 already, you know, showed scientific evidence that this was going to be a problem, that it was already starting to be a problem. And that didn't do anything. And then that there was already political concern starting earliest in the U.S. in 1965 when President Lyndon B. Johnson talked about how this was going to be an issue. And we still didn't do anything about it. So it's quite a social experiment, because we're literally trying every single psychological method in the book and we're not coming up with anything. Yeah. So yeah, it's another term that they use to call the problem is a creeping problem. You know, slow violence, creeping problem, not in my backyard. Yeah. So now we're on to chapter 14, which is on page 65, and it's called Costing the Earth, Why We Want to Gain the Whole World and Yet Lose Our Lives, which was intense of a title. And one of the parts that I'm going to read you starts on page 65, but it's mostly on page 66, which is, in 2006, Sir Nicholas Stern, a former chief economist of the World Bank, wrote a hugely influential review of the economics of climate change, which claims, though his critics argue otherwise, to provide a balanced economic evaluation of the short and long-term costs of climate change. From his 700 pages of dense analysis, Stern produced a key finding that reducing greenhouse gas emissions that cause climate change would cost us around 1% of our annual income for the next 50 years. However, he warned, if we do not do this, the annual costs from extreme climate events will rise to anything from 5% to 20% of our annual income indefinitely. Now, you would think that would impact people. It didn't. Spoiler. I actually remember, when was this? This was, 2006. I actually remember hearing about this, probably actually though in like high school or college or something, because I would have been too young to really understand the importance of it in 2006. But yeah, I remember hearing about that, and that is a common argument that it's going to kill our economy, which is one of the main things that people that are usually avoiding the topic of climate change care most about. So shouldn't they care? No. But then we go into talking about how short-term falls in their living standard and their chances of uncertain potential far-off costs makes it so that people basically procrastinate on it being an issue. Basically, he was just saying a long thing for the fact that we're really good at procrastinating. I mean, who hasn't procrastinated on a test that we knew about 3 weeks ahead of time and we don't start studying until the night before? Definitely didn't do this with reading this book chapters. Anyways, bottom line, humans are really good at that. So that's not all that surprising, really. In chapter 68, page 68, not chapter 68, he also talks about how, this is again how culture can impact how people view whether or not future issues should be addressed now, kind of thing, future planning sort of thing. But one of the major things is that it's important to think about this issue and talk about it with people in a way that appeals to their own group identity and their own visual social norms, so that basically you have to individualize it, which is something I talked about a little bit last week, because it's difficult for people that are in media or environmentalists to be able to do that while also attracting a large audience, because everybody's different. So it's like, how are you attracting a whole group, but also talking to the individual at the same time? But one of the things that he said that people need to talk about it in the context of more is that we need to see it as a morally charged issue, instead between self-interest and collective good.
Mm-hmm.
And that's also something that we've kind of seen in this current pandemic it's something that's current on, that's relevant, but it's something that we're seeing with this pandemic, where you have other countries who are staying indoors as individuals using masks because they're seeing it as an overall collective good. Whereas in parts here in the US, we are seeing more of the individual's needs, and they're prioritizing themselves over the collective good. And it's just a matter of whether or not we are seeing addressing as a collective good as our moral standpoint, instead of individualism. We really have to see it from a moral collective standpoint if we're going to engage in everything, because if we only see it from an individual standpoint, then that just leads us to not do anything about it. Which is another thing I want to get into, is talking about individual action versus group action. So look for that. It'll be a video coming at some point. So yeah. Another part that I want to read is on page 70, and it goes as such. If, however, climate change is regarded as an active and informed choice, it feels far more like being a volunteer in a medical research. Imagine, for example, that you are offered an immediate boost in your current standard of living if you agree to pass on an irreversible distribution of the world's wealthier systems to your children. If you feel you can face it, look at the 4-degree impacts at the end of the book. Okay, whatever. How much more income would you like to receive for that? So it's basically talking about how we really need to address it as we're going to benefit from it. This is a good thing. There are good things to come out of it. It's in our best interest. It will benefit us in the near future if we act on it now.
It will create jobs.
It will create jobs.
Right? I mean,
yeah.
So that's a very
it will create jobs.
Line right now.
It will boost the economy. Climate change. It will
obviously make people healthier.
Absolutely, because it will decrease the amount of air pollutants in general. And also, there's also some unforeseen benefits too. Like, for example, when we're transitioning our lifestyles to talk more about the environment and to be more in tune with nature, then I think that's also going to help our mental state too. So there's a lot of benefits, but if we see it from the perspective of benefits, primarily job growth, honestly, I feel like that's one of the main ones, is if we see it from that perspective, then we'll be more likely to act on it. So that's something that we need to get better at talking about, us being environmentalists and journalists and activists. We need to talk about it from the perspective of what can be gained in the near term future. What is in it for people who change? How will they benefit? It's almost like we need some sort of reward system, like if you decrease your environmental impact by this amount, then you will receive a new car. I don't know. But also, we don't want to see it just from an individual standpoint, because that also, it doesn't quite work. So, yeah, complicated. Okay. Chapter 15, certain about uncertainty, how we use uncertainty as a justification for an action. Again, if you are entering this now, please feel free to comment on points that I talk about. I will immediately stop talking and look at your points. Yeah, so please do. Okay, so in this chapter, chapter 15, which is on page 72 of the book Don't Even Think About It by George Marshall, we are talking about basically the difference between the scientific definition of uncertainty versus regular definition of uncertainty. And that is, again, another video that I want to do is just literally talking about the difference between some scientific terms and regular terms, because it confuses people a lot. Like, a common one is what a theory is. In a psychological term, a theory is kind of a guess, you know, but in terms of like the scientific theory, it's basically a fact, you know. So an example of this is talking about uncertainty, because in the science community, technically nothing is ever 100% certain. And they are really intent on covering their asses about that. Because if you are wrong and you declared an absolute, then you are going to be in big doo-doo in the scientific community. So that is why for the longest time, scientists were talking about the issue with some hesitation. They were talking about natural disasters being equated to climate change trends with some hesitation. They didn't want to specifically say this storm was caused by climate change, because there is always that level of uncertainty. But from a public standpoint, it's not enough uncertainty for really the public to consider it uncertain, you know?
I loved this chapter because it also talked about the threat of like nuclear war and stuff like that.
Yes.
And which is a lot less certain than climate change. And yet we put so much more money and attention on the threat of nuclear war than we do on climate change.
We put a lot more attention on hypotheticals than we do on an actual. Yeah. I liked this part that said, so 1% chance of a terrorist attack could be acted on as enough as a certainty, but 90% chance of severe climate disruption is too uncertain for action. So it's not 100%. It's 99%. So Rahul says, this is interesting. So not so 100%. It's 98 or 99% of scientists believe that climate change is happening. But for some reason, a lot of deniers really like to act on just that 2% of scientists. They love to bring them out and have them talk about it. Not as much nowadays, but definitely a lot in the past.
Yeah, in the past.
And then they would just put Bill Nye against them. It's always a bunch of the deniers that they happen to find, and Bill Nye defending them. But yeah, it's pretty damn certain. It's, you know, it's as certain as science can be, to be honest. I mean, there's always going to be some detractors. There's always going to be people that are disproving it. But it's pretty certain. Yeah. You know? I mean, we have called election votes with lower percentages than that. Rahul says, I guess there are leaving room for human error. Yeah, they're leaving room. Exactly. For human error. That's what scientists do, is they like to leave room for human error, because that is just the nature of the game. And absolutes, again, in science is just really not a thing.
They're just extremely analytical.
They're very analytical. Yeah. One part that I found interesting in this, if there's anything else you want to talk about with that topic, please continue to talk in the comments. But all I'm going to say is that a place that a lot of people have been able to make it more of an absolute argument is when you're listening to military strategists, because they are ones that are already acting on the problems of climate change, such as sea level rise, natural disaster probability, as being a national threat. Yeah, you know, a national security threat.
The military has already examined it, and they're already moving their bases.
Yeah, the military's already on it. Like, the public's still confused, but the military's like, let's just do this. And yeah, so like a lot of research is coming out with, like, from the military side of things, and they are quite certain about it, and they are acting very certain about it from behind the scenes. So it's kind of a bit of a dichotomy there.
Yeah.
It's interesting how that works. And I think, honestly, that we really do need to frame it from the perspective of a national security issue more.
Yeah.
Because, like, nuclear war, that was seen as a national security issue.
Mm-hmm.
You know, terrorist attack, national security issue. But we haven't really talked about climate change from a national security issue. And that's kind of one of the things I'm hoping that, you know, if hopefully Biden gets elected, that he will make it an executive order to move on it, because we have moved on it things via executive order for much less certain threats. So yeah. So that was chapter 15, and now for chapter 16, it's called Paddling in the Pool of Worry, How We Choose What to Ignore. Yeah.
It's just saying a lot of stuff about we only have the bandwidth to worry about so many things.
Right.
And if we've got COVID and we've got job losses and the economy is a mess, then it's really, really hard to worry about one more thing that's further out.
Rahul asks, yes, when is this becoming a real deal? Anytime soon, I hope. Politically, I hope really soon. If you look at the Biden plan, he does have plans on day one, but I don't know whether or not those imply that he would also have control of the Senate by that point. So, you know, that's something, that's another video that I want to do, that I will do especially soon if, you know, determining the results of this election, because a lot less can be done nationally when we don't have support by the Senate, because we're just going to get blocked like Obama most of the time.
Yes, but on the other hand, Gavin Newsom, California.
I knew where you were going with this. But that might mean that there has to be more done with states. And if you look at one of my other previous videos talking about Exxon, and all the lawsuits that are happening against Exxon and other fossil fuel companies, right now it's being disputed whether or not those issues should be taken to state courts or federal courts. Exxon wants it to be federal courts, because then there's a better chance, because right now the Fed is not very strong on doing environmental action. There's a better chance that Exxon would have the support of the federal government and the Supreme Court, rather than if they did from a state-to-state basis, in which case there would be a better chance that something might actually come from it. So it's interesting. And that is another video I want to do, which is state action versus national action. Mom, I need this to be a full-time job. No, I have a job and I like it. Okay. Rahul says, is Newsom taking money from Tesla? Just wondering. I don't know.
I have never heard that.
I've never heard that either. So, like, are you referring to taking money as via taxes? Or what do you mean by that? He says lobbying.
I don't know. We should look into that.
Yeah, I don't know. That's a really good question. I don't know. We should look into it. Oh, for electric cars. Well, right. So there was...
Well, and he's also dealing with Ford. Gavin Newsom is dealing with Ford as well.
Yeah.
So not just Tesla for electric cars.
Yeah. Well, he did say that that all new cars being sold in California by 2035 have to only be electric. He moved on that. In the way of lobbying efforts, I'm not sure, actually. That's a really good question, and I definitely do want to look into that, because that would be interesting to know.
Mm-hmm.
I am not good with legal jargon and understanding the lobbying stuff, so that's something I need to educate myself on. Yeah, but that's a really good question. Thank you, Rahul, for helping promote conversation on this. And keep going, please. Yeah, just interested, Rahul says. Yeah, me too. Me too. Help me look it up. Yeah, so this last chapter, yeah, it basically just talks about how it well, what were you saying, Mom? That there's only so much people can worry about.
That's right.
Yeah. And that's something that I have noticed a lot too. Again, it really depends, I feel like, based on where you're at in your life, especially right now with the current pandemic and stuff. Adding climate change onto that, I imagine, is a lot for people. You know, they don't want to think about that on top of everything else. But if you do think about that on top of everything else, then when you're fixing the problem for one thing, you can also be fixing the problem for the other thing.
Like in the European
And happy
Union.
to be there. Happy you're here too, Rahul.
Like in the European Union, where they're allocating so much money for COVID, but it has to be green.
And China too. China was talking about how he wants people to build back green. Yeah, so I think that would definitely help, is if we moved it on the right direction instead of just going back to the way it was before, go back to better, you know? Yeah. So I hate that it has to be problems on top of each other, but when something is collapsing, it's better to see all the variables that need to be fixed at once versus just focusing on the original reason why it collapsed, you know?
Yeah.
And that being said, one part that I didn't mention before, but I think I got it from chapter 15. I guess our last comments on these chapters is that I have said this for a while, and I think that this needs to be a thing. We see anti-smoking commercials everywhere. You know, the amount of Proposition 22 commercials we saw everywhere. Where have you ever seen a climate change commercial? Have you ever seen anyone? Have you ever seen a commercial where people said, hey, see, Rahul says, nope. We haven't talked about, like, for example, what if there was commercials that said the only way we can truly act on climate change is if we get the Senate? Or just anything having to do with climate change. We don't see those at all, but we see no smoking and vaping commercials all the time. They have that shit down to a science. The climate is changing. Yes, it is, Rahul. The climate is changing, just very fast. But yeah, we don't see that. We never see commercials on that.
We need to ask Mr. Bloomberg to donate some funds.
Bloomberg, get on it. There, that was my contribution to society. But that was actually something that I mentioned with the advertising students. I remember when I was in school, I almost made that a project, and then I was too busy with all my other little startup projects. I never got around to it. But I have always really liked how the anti-smoking commercials did it. They're punchy, they're youthful, they're straight to the point, they're pretty demonizing. I think I would like it to be more on a positive front, frankly. But they're effective, you know? The data has shown that they have helped decrease the amount of smokers. Now, with vaping, that's a whole other thing. I don't know. But they've been very punchy on that. And I don't know why there hasn't been anything having to do with the climate. There has been no advertising. And you know what? We've had the money. We could do it. Seriously. Okay. Mom, are there any other final points that you want to talk about before we close up?
I am good. Thank you.
She is good. She is ready to cook dinner. That is all for today. Thank you so much. Shout out to Rahul for coming, and Patrick. Thank you so much for coming too. I hope you subscribed, and I will see you next week. Where we are going to
Monday topic.
Oh, on Monday we are going to talk about how climate change impacts hurricanes and the hurricane season. So especially if you're from the East Coast, that hits you hard. So go ahead and check me out on Monday for that. Thank you, Rahul, for the nice. And on Thursday, we are going to cover chapters 13. No, is it not? I thought, that's wrong. 17 to 20. We're going to read chapters 17 through 20 for next week. So make sure that you do your readings, if you please. I do highly recommend this book. I really do. If you haven't gotten the book, I do recommend. How many chapters does it have in all? It has, if I go to...
It's a lot because they're really short chapters.
Yeah, they're super short chapters. So it's 42 chapters. And as you can see, the book is not really that long. I mean, it's in the 200 range of pages. And so some of the chapters are literally a page and a half. So Rahul says, sold. Yes, check it out. It is really interesting. I will say for me personally, because I have a lot of experience with trying to understand why people don't understand that this is an issue, a lot of it is honestly review for me. But it is a really good read for those who haven't explored the issue as much. I do highly recommend it. It covers a lot of the main points. And with that, I'm going to shut up for now. Thank you so much for coming to my TED Talk. And I will see you all next week on Monday. So thank you for answering all the things, of course. So bye, subscribe, like, comment, all that good stuff. See you next week.